Quick, you have 30 days to make 10K in real estate without any of your own money. What do? Flipping takes months with no promise of profit. Buying rentals is the long-term play, no quick cash. And wholesaling will set you back a few $1,000s just to get started with leads. But today, I made $31,000 in profit without using any of those strategies. I did it with transactional funding. And if making money like that sounds too good to be true, that's because it is, until you fully understand every detail of how it works. After that, well, let's just say $31,000 was not the only money I made this month with that exact strategy. And this underground method of getting into real estate investing without any of your own money is growing rapidly, and I'm here to make sure you do not miss out. So in this video, I'm gonna be giving you a mini masterclass on transactional funding, from the mistakes that people make to the sneaky indicators you've got a good deal on your hands. And by the end of this video, not only will you be well on your way to transactional funding mastery, but I'll even give you a little gift that'll walk you through exactly what to do over the next 30 days to make that $10,000. Let's start from the beginning. All right, now in order to get good at transactional funding, you have to understand every single detail of a real estate transaction, because the whole point of getting into transactional funding is inserting yourself into other people's deals. So first, we're gonna talk about the basic timeline of a real estate transaction. Start to finish, what can you expect? What does it look like? So if we start over here with going under contract on a property, and then over here is when we actually purchase the property, the first thing that you need to understand in order to get good at doing what I do is this exact timeline right here. What happens between the contract and the purchase? Now, the contract is basic, right? This is whether you're an investor, whether you're buying your primary house, it doesn't matter. You're going on a contract, you're signing a document that lists things like how much you're purchasing the property for, how long you're gonna be before you close on the property, doing inspections, all of that good stuff, right? And right after the contract, usually within a 1 to 3 day window, right here, you are going to deposit what's called EMD. Right after you go on a contract on a property, again, no matter what kind of property it is. And that EMD deposit stands for an earnest money deposit. It's called a lot of things, but in general, it is looked at as a good faith deposit, which means that you are putting down this contract and then you're putting a little bit of money behind it to say, I'm serious. I'm not just writing this contract. I'm not just signing something. I'm going to follow through on my promise. So there's a legal obligation here to put down this money. Now, typically speaking, let's say, for example, we have a purchase price up here of $500,000. Your earnest money deposit on this deal typically is going to be around 1%, okay? So on this example, that EMD would equal $5,000. Now, we're not even getting into the actual transactional funding side of things yet. We just want to walk through the entire transaction. So we put down the EMD right here, right? And now that's in the first 1 to 3 days. Now we've got this purchase over here. And that purchase is typically going to be about 30 days later for a basic single family transaction. So we've got about 30 days between here and here, barring any setbacks. So after we put down the EMD, what the heck else is gonna happen before this deal actually closes? Well, right after this EMD goes down, we've got another spot on our timeline right here that we're gonna call the inspection period. And this right here, from there to there, is typically going to be 10 to 14 days. Now, that number right there is arbitrary. It's agreed on in this contract right here, so it could really be anything. But typically it's gonna be 10 to 14 days, and obviously, just like the name states, inspection period means that it's the time with which you're going to inspect a property before buying it. So you might be going in and looking for, is the roof in good shape? Is the AC unit new? Is there mold in the house? You know, whatever else it may be. And in this time, up to the inspection period, if there were to be something you found, or usually even if you just change your mind, you can back out of the deal right here and you can get this money, this $5,000 back. So that's what the inspection period is for. It's to give you the opportunity to check things out, because when you go under contract on a deal, a lot of times, I know when I bought my first house, we went under contract on a deal that we had never actually seen, right? We'd seen pictures, but we'd never ever stepped foot in there. So now we gotta have somebody go in there, check it out, make sure everything's good, right? This will be very important to the processes that we talk about. So we've got under contract, we put down our EMD, now we get past the inspection period. Now, once we get past the inspection period, we've got the rest of this timeline, so another 2 weeks or so before we hit that purchase. What else is gonna happen? We've already passed the inspection, we've approved that everything is good. The main and last thing that we'll put in here is the title search. And this is something that's typically not done until after the inspection period. But what the title search does is it looks for all of the money that is owed on a property. So you may have the previous seller, right? They may have had a mortgage on the property. They may have had a lien on the property, which could be like a lien for them to pay off a new AC unit or something like that. A lien is essentially just another loan. So basically the title search is looking for who owns the property, how many loans are on the property, and what's all the things that need to be done in order to get to our purchase. But once we've gone through that, this is going to be the basis of every single real estate transaction. Again, whether you are a primary home buyer or an investor alike, it does not matter. And this is the foundation of transactional funding. Why? Because if we're to look at this, let me make some space here. So if we're to look at this timeline right here, right? We'll make it a little more simple. We've got this 30-day timeline right here. And then if you go down here, you've got everything after the purchase, right? So you purchase a property and you're gonna rent it out. Well, over here is when you're gonna get tenants in there, or you're gonna turn it into an Airbnb, or do whatever the heck you wanna do, or move into the house, right? And after this purchase, if we draw a little dotted line here, what happens after this purchase is you get funding for your deal, right? So you go buy your primary home and you get a mortgage. If you are fix and flipping a property, then you're gonna get typically what's called a hard money loan, or HML. If you are needing additional funds, you might get something like what's called gap funding, which is a form of private money lending. Or we'll be generic here and just put PML, which stands for private money lending. Now, you can see here's all the way up to purchase, and then all of these things right here happen after the purchase. Now, what that means is that they're outside of escrow. Escrow is these 30 days right here. When we are putting in the EMD, when we were going through the inspection period, doing the title search and all that stuff, that's happening with what's called a title company. Now, in some states in America, this may be in a closing attorney instead, but it's the same thing. The title company is the one that is receiving this EMD. They are facilitating the contracts. They're dealing with the title searches, all of these things, all the paperwork, all the stuff that you definitely don't want to do. That's what they're doing. And at the title company, they're going to have what's called escrow. And escrow is where they hold the money. The escrow account is something that they are legally obligated not to touch that money. It's not money that they can go spend, but they are legally obligated to have an escrow account at a title company to hold funds, for example, your earnest money deposit. So if you're wondering, where does an earnest money deposit go in a real estate transaction? This is where it goes. You send it into a third party, right? You're not going to just send it to the seller. If you send it to the seller and you back out during the inspection period, you think they're going to send it back to you? Probably not, right? So that's why you send it to a third party. And this is really important because escrow exists over here in these 30 days. Over here, no escrow, right? This is after the purchase. So your mortgage is backed by the property itself. Your hard money loan is backed by the property itself. Your gap funding is backed by the property. Your private money lending is backed by the property itself. But inside of escrow, this is within the transaction. And because it's within the transaction starting when you go under contract and ending when the purchase is complete, right? That is the baseline of a transaction. And in those 30 days within the transaction, that's where you get transactional funding. Any funding that occurs between here and here, that is your transactional funding. And so what I want to do next, now that we have a baseline understanding of what this timeline looks like and how to actually understand it, is I want to break down to you guys a couple of the different types of transactional funding and also types that aren't transactional with timelines and amounts so that you know how to indicate when you are looking at a deal, when you are talking to an investor. I know a lot of you guys are just getting started. How can you differentiate what's what, right? Everything, real estate or anything else alike, always throw around these terms, PML, HML, EMD, all of these things, right? What the heck are we talking about? How can we be educated? How can we have a clear conversation so that you can get into this and make that 10K? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so now that we understand the fundamentals of the transaction, I'm going to break down 4 different types of funding for you so that you understand which ones happen where, what the timelines look, what the return looks like. And by the end of this little section right here, you will be smarter than 99% of people when it comes to transactional funding, because this right here, being able to differentiate between different types of funding is the key to being able to have high-level conversations to get into the right deals and avoid the wrong ones. So here's the 4 things that we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to talk about EMD. Next, we're gonna talk about double closing. After that, we're gonna talk about gap funding, I brought up a little bit earlier. And then finally, we'll talk about private money lending, or PML, okay? So let's start with EMD. We've already given you the baseline of EMD, right? It happens at the beginning of every transaction, and there's a couple things that you need to understand. What it is, who needs it, how much do you charge if you're going to fund it for somebody, and what does the timeline look like to get that money back, okay? So first of all, EMD, who needs it? Well, we're gonna differentiate everything today into two different people. There's buyers, and then there's wholesalers. Now, a wholesaler, so that we're on the same page, if this is a seller, and this is a buyer, and these guys are buying a property, right? The buyer is buying the property from the seller. And let's say the seller was gonna sell their house for $500,000. Well, they're selling their house for $500,000, but this buyer doesn't come to them directly. Because a lot of times in investing, what happens is we have a middleman, and this person is the wholesaler. And so this wholesaler gets a contract with the seller saying they'll sell this house for $500,000, but then they go find this buyer, and they tell the buyer, I'll sell you this house for $520,000. So they buy it for 500, sell for 520, they make the difference, right? They make that additional plus 20,000. And the way they do that is what's called an assignment of contract. So they got that contract for 500,000, then they got an additional piece of paper, not an additional contract, but an additional piece of paper that assigns the rights to the contract to this person, and this person pays the wholesaler $20,000 for the rights to do that. And that's literally what wholesaling is. You're buying a property low, selling it high. It could be a luxury property, it could be a crappy property, it could be anything in between, but that's what a wholesaler is actually doing. So we've got our seller, our wholesaler, and our buyer. That's gonna be our main characters for breaking down these different types of funding. Now, the next thing that we need to understand is who uses what type of funding, right? So EMD, who's gonna use it? Well, we just talked about EMD is the first thing that goes down on every single transaction. So by definition, both of these guys are gonna use it. You've got a wholesaler and you've got a buyer. Both of them are gonna use EMD on their transaction. Now, that's so important because when you learn what we're about to talk about and you wanna go talk to people about it, you have to talk to the right people, right? You can't go talk to somebody who's not one of these people and be able to fund EMD. So wholesaler and buyer are funding it. Now, we talked about on a typical purchase price, right? We'll say that our purchase PP for purchase price is 500,000. The classic EMD for that is 5 grand. Now, why would somebody need this funded? This question comes up all the time. People are like, well, why would somebody need their earnest money funded? Well, it depends on the person, depends on the situation. There's a lot of different situations. Sometimes it could be that they're new. That is probably the least ideal scenario for funding somebody's deal, right? Somebody's new, they're told they need 5,000 bucks, they don't have 5,000 bucks, and you as a transactional funder could come in and say, hey, I'll fund that for you. Now, why is this a bad idea? Because if they're new, then they don't have a track record, and they don't have any proof, and they don't have any experience to actually get the deal across the finish line. In my experience, that means they're probably not gonna close the deal. So that's not the best scenario. But what other reasons might somebody use that? Well, for example, if a wholesaler is good, which there's not a lot of them, but if they are good, then they might be doing 5, 10, 15 deals a month. And if they're doing that many deals a month, and they require $5,000 for every deal, well now instead of just $5,000, let's say they do 10 deals this month, that's $50,000. And remember the timeline that we talked about, that $50,000 sits for the entire month. So that means every month they have $50,000 that's just sitting somewhere doing absolutely nothing. And that is actually the way that I got into transactional funding. Originally was funding for people like that were doing high volume. Now, there also might be buyers who are borrowing earnest money deposits, and the reason for that is because a buyer is typically going to either A, use their own money, which means they probably don't need your help, or B, go raise private money from people in their network, other investors, people they know, for their deal to purchase it. But that EMD happens at the very beginning of the timeline, right? It happens at square one. And this buyer is probably gonna go raise capital that they don't need until the end of the transaction. And so what happens here is that I might put down this $5,000 for them for that 30 days, and then at the end of the 30 days, the buyer will go raise that private capital, and that will replace the money. So there's a lot of different scenarios where somebody might need this, but whether it's a wholesaler or a buyer, here's the scenario that we have. So where do I come in? Well, at the very beginning of the transaction, when the earnest money is due, that's when I would come in and fund it for them. And if I did, whether it's the wholesaler or the buyer, they would come to me and say, hey, Ryan, I need $5,000 for earnest money deposit. Here's a bunch of details about the deal, blah, blah, blah. Are we good to go? And here's what I would require. First of all, so if I'm going to fund an earnest money deposit of $5,000, I'm going to personally charge a 40% return. Now, that might sound a little bit crazy, 40%, right? But there's a lot of things to understand about earnest money deposits. One, this is a much more niche thing than what a lot of people do, and so you have to understand the fundamentals. That's why we're here today. Number two, you have to have the knowledge to understand when you fund this money, how do you protect it, right? Anybody can fund $5,000 or go find somebody to fund $5,000, but how do you make sure that money is safe and protected? And so there's a lot of things that go into these transactions, and because of that, you can charge a higher premium. So on this deal, we would be charging a $2,000 profit to fund that deal for them, okay? So what you need to understand for earnest money deposits is what's the typical return? This is what I charge. It doesn't mean it's what you need to charge. I would say on average, people range from 20 to 50% for the return on these. It can go even lower. It can go even higher. I've seen people do it for free. I've seen people do it for 100%. But that's the general range. So that's number one. Number two is what's the timeline for this? And because it's the earnest money deposit and you're putting it in at the beginning, you can expect this to go for approximately 30 days. Now, sometimes it can be less than 30 days, and sometimes it could be more than 30 days, just depending on the transaction. Bigger transactions sometimes take longer. Small ones might be really quick, might be 14 days in and out, bing, bang, boom. But either way, this is the percentage that you can expect. This is how long it's gonna take, and these are the two people that you can seek out for funding. So that's your earnest money deposits. Now, what I want you guys to note from this as I go down the line here is that I'm gonna be talking to you guys about the timelines, right? And the percentages right here. And why this is important, I wanna give you a little bit of foreshadowing for as we go through this stuff. Why this is important is that if I come to you and I say, hey, I need $5,000, you have to be able to, from this video, be able to say, okay, what kind of money is it, right? Do you need $5,000 to fix your furnace? Do you need $5,000 for inventory for your business? Or do you need $5,000 for an earnest money deposit? And you can ask somebody that, right? I could ask you point blank what the money is for, but you can't trust that. What you have to do is you have to use context clues. So if somebody says, I need $5,000 for 90 days, something's off, right? I need $90,000 and I'm willing to pay you, $5,000, I'm willing to pay you a 1% return, something's off, right? And so you can use these clues, you can use the context that you have for each one of these deals to determine which one is which. And even if they say it's one thing, you'll hear a lot of funny things with earnest money deposits. People will say something like, well, it's like an earnest money deposit. There's no like an earnest money deposit. It either is or it isn't. It's either on the contract or it's not. And so you have to be able to use those context clues to differentiate. So this is earnest money deposits. Next, we'll break down double closing. Okay, so next up after earnest money deposits is double closing. Now, personally, just so you know, double closing is one of my favorite strategies to use in transactional funding. But what actually is it? Let's draw out our same example that we did last time. So we've got our seller, and double closings will include a wholesaler. So we'll draw our wholesaler right here. And then finally, at the end, we've got our buyer. Now, how do these transactions work? Well, in the exact same way as the last one, right? We had the seller selling this property for $500,000, and the wholesaler got that contract. And then the wholesaler was selling the property to the end buyer for $520,000, right? We just talked about that. And in the last example, what happened was they bought that property with the contract, right? And then they assigned that contract to the buyer. That is wholesaling. That is an assignment. Double closing is different. Same people, different structure, okay? So seller to wholesaler, $500,000, that's one contract. But then, instead of assigning the property, the wholesaler has a second contract that goes to the buyer. Now, just so you know the lingo here, that first contract would be called an AB contract, and the second one would be called the BC contract. Not crazy, right? A to B, B to C. That's how it's broken up, but there's two contracts in a double closing, and that's what's important. Now, the reason why somebody might double close, there's really four primary reasons that somebody would double close. One of the reasons is that they just want to protect their money, right? And what I mean by that is that sometimes a seller might not like the fact that they're buying it for this much and selling it for this much. And if you assign a contract, the seller sees how much money you make. And so instead of doing that, you might double close instead to protect that money, okay? That's the first reason why. The second reason why is that there's a lot of regulations right now in states against assigning contracts. And so there may be states that don't even allow for you to assign the contract in the first place. And that would be reason number two. There's a regulation against it, and so you have to double close instead. The third reason is that some companies are not willing to buy on assignment contracts. So if this buyer is a more established buyer, like a hedge fund or a company like that, they have rules in place that say they will not buy assignment contracts. There's legal stuff behind it and all this jazz. But what you need to know is that because they're not willing to buy on assignments, they have to buy on a double close, which makes this scenario valid. And all of those things together are reasons why this might happen. But here's what's important is that it's seller to wholesaler, wholesaler to buyer, AB contract, and BC contract, okay? Now, let's look at the transaction itself. So let me break down the same 4 elements I did for you on the last one. The first thing that you need to know is who are you going to work with for a double close? Now, on the last EMD, right, you can work with a wholesaler, you can work with a buyer. On a double close, you don't work with both. You just work with the wholesaler. So actually, I'm gonna draw this image back up here to help it make more sense. But the person that you work with is the wholesaler. I'll circle them. So this is the only person that you will work with on the double close. And then we've got our much taller, accidentally much taller buyer. Okay, seller, wholesaler, buyer. Wholesaler is the one that you go to. That's the person that you're going to work with. That's the person that's going to bring deals to you. All right. Now, in our example where we're moving the money, we've got the 500K and the 520,000. And here's how the transaction actually works. Because we have an AB and a BC contract, you are legally required to close this deal, the AB, before you close this deal, the BC. So let's say this buyer was coming in with $520,000. Everybody's happy, right? But the title company is going to require you to come up with all the funds to buy the property for $500,000 before you can resell the property for $520,000. This happens all the time. And so what they'll say is, hey, you got to come up with this 500 grand. And as soon as you deposit 500 grand, then this person can buy it for 520 grand and pay you out. And that is where the transactional funder comes into play. So the transactional funder would bring this $500,000. That's what I would do. I would bring the $500,000, and in exchange, they would resell the property immediately for $520,000. And remember this $20,000 gap right here, right? They're making plus 20K. They would take a little bit of that profit and pay it to me for bringing the $500,000. Now, a couple questions that you're probably asking. Number one, where the heck do you come up with $500,000 if you're just getting started? Number two, how much do we charge? And number three, how long does it take? Let's start with the timeline and the cost. So for $500,000, I charge 1.5% interest, okay? Now again, different people charge different things. I'll say rough estimate 1 to 3% probably for what people charge. I kind of go right in the middle towards the low end. I charge 1.5% for the double closing. So $500,000, I'm charging 1.5%. If my math is correct, that means that I would be making $7,500 on this deal. Now, the other thing that we just talked about, the earnest money deposits, if you fund those, it takes about 30 days. So how long does it take to fund this? Well, remember, I just talked about how you do this and then immediately we resell it. So double closes are basically immediate. The only thing that double close you have to wait for is literally for money to transfer from one account to the other. So on average, timeline for a double close is less than 24 hours. I have done many of these transactions. Never once has a transaction been over 24 hours. Typically, they're between 1 to 2 hours, sometimes a little bit longer, but always less than 24 hours. So we're charging 1.5%, which is $7,500. It's less than 24 hours. Now the last question is, how the heck are you coming up with 500 grand if you're a normal human being like me and you don't just have $500,000 sitting in your pocket? Because if you did, you probably wouldn't be watching this video right now. And that, my friends, is actually really simple. If you look below this video, you'll see a link to my free funding community, first link in the description, and that community is full of people who do stuff like this full time. And so all you have to do, this is, by the way, is how I got started, and it's how everybody that I work with now gets started. All you have to do is you have to find somebody to partner with on this deal. And the cool thing is when you find somebody to partner with, you might think, oh, that's gonna be, how am I supposed to raise $500,000? You're right, it can be really hard to raise that much money if it's for a long amount of time, but what about less than 24 hours, right? What you're doing here is you're saying, hey, I need $500,000 for less than a day. And then what I do, you don't have to do this, but I'll just let you guys know how I do it, is I take this and I split it 50-50. So I say, hey, if you bring the money, I brought the deal, we'll split the profits 50-50. So both of you make whatever that is, $3,750, right? For less than 24 hours of work. Sound pretty good? Yeah, it's pretty cool. Now, here's the thing about this. Just like everything else, remember, it's the indicators, right? How much are you able to charge? What is the timeline? That's how you determine whether or not something is a double close or isn't a double close. But as I said, this is one of my favorite strategies to get into. It is a very profitable way to make money. No, you don't make a crazy amount of interest, but if you send the money out over breakfast, you usually have the money back over lunch. And that's what's so powerful about the double closing. So this is a full breakdown of double closing. You are working with wholesalers on these. You're expecting to charge somewhere around that. It should take less than 24 hours, and that's how you can determine that it's a double closing. Now, next, we're gonna talk about gap lending. Okay, so next, let's talk about gap lending. Now, gap lending is going to be the spooky thing that people bring up to you with the EMD and the double closes we just talked about, trying to convince you that it's something it's not. So this is really important. Let's talk about what gap lending actually is. Now, in general, gap lending, per the name, is money that's used to fill the gap. And typically speaking, gap lending is going to be done on a fix and flip. So let's break down what that looks like. I'll draw a house right here and pretend like it's a crappy house that we're about to fix and flip, right? And let's say this house is selling for just $200,000. Now, on a fix and flip, when somebody buys it, they have to go get the funds to fix and flip the property. And typically that's going to take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, hopefully if all goes well, to fix that property. So they go get a special type of loan to fix and flip the property and resell it. And there's multiple different ways that you can do this, but the most common way is to get what's called a hard money loan, or HML. Okay, so a fix and flipper is going to go get a hard money loan to buy this property. Now, again, there's so many ways that this can go, but for the purposes of this example, a hard money loan is going to oftentimes look at a percentage of the purchase price to loan you. Why? Because if they give you all the money and you don't have any skin in the game, then you're a lot less likely to perform, right? There's no negatives on your end. So for a hard money loan, let's say, for example, they are going to lend 80% of the purchase price, right? 80% of the purchase price, which would equal 160,000, right? So we've got a total of 200,000. We've got a hard money loan that's funding 160,000. That leaves us with $40,000 more to get this property purchased, right? So we need 40,000 to close. And then the other thing is that if you've fixed and flipped, or you know anybody that fixed and flipped, obviously you don't just purchase the property, right? You got to fix the property up. You got to do all the repairs. You got to pay all the contractors. You got to fix all the broken everything and put it all together. And so we need $40,000 to close, but then we may need another $50,000 for repairs. So if we put these two things together, that means that we need an additional $90,000 here on top of the hard money loan we have in order to purchase this and then flip it and hopefully sell it for, let's say, $300,000 and make a profit, right? And so this money right here is the gap between the loan amount and the amount of money that's needed. And this is where a gap loan would come into play. So a fix and flipper could come to you as somebody that is in the funding space in real estate and say, hey, I have this property, amazing fix and flip, it's gonna make a bunch of money, but I need an additional $90,000 to get this thing done. And when you are lending, and here's the interesting thing, this is lending, not funding, right? We talked about the timeline at the beginning. Remember, gap lending, when did it occur? Inside of the transaction or outside of the transaction? It's outside, right? It's after the property has been purchased. You purchase it, and then you fix and flip the property and resell it. So we already know this is not transactional funding, but I want to give you guys some of the indicators like I have on the other things so that you know how to pick these out, because a lot of people are going to come to you for this funding. It is the hardest type of funding to raise, hence why the most people need it, right? And so question number one, who needs it? It's our fix and flipper, all right? That's who needs gap funding. Now, how much do people typically charge for gap funding? Remember, earnest money deposits is between 20 and 50% on average. A double closing is between 1 to 5% on average. And remember, 30 days for EMD, less than 24 hours for double close. The timeline for gap lending is going to be 3 to 6 months. So you can see we're already going on a completely different roadmap here, right? Short term, no, this is long term. It's not crazy long term, but it's medium long term. 3 to 6 months. The average return on these is anywhere, let's say from 15 to 30% return. But remember, this 15 to 30% return is over 3 to 6 months. It's not like the earnest money deposit where it's 40% in 30 days or less. This is 15 to 30% in 3 to 6 months. So it's longer term. And the most important thing you need to understand right here is the timeline, the return, the person themselves. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I need $100,000 and I need it for 6 months. Right off the bat, what can you determine? Okay, it's not EMD, right? Even if they say it's EMD, it's not. You don't need it for that long. It's not EMD and it's not a double closing. You know that by the timeline. So next, you can use the timeline they give you, 6 months. Okay, this is probably some sort of a gap funding situation, right? How much are you offering for the return or how much are you able to pay? Okay, you're a fix and flipper, got it. So you need gap funding, is that right? You need gap funding for your purchase. Yeah, I need gap funding. Cool, got it. So now we're on the same page. Now, I'm not telling you guys you can't go do gap funding, but what I am saying is it's not transactional, right? It's not protected within the transaction. It's longer term, and there's a lot more issues that can come up. Now, nobody would gap fund if it wasn't a viable business, so it absolutely is a viable business, but there's a lot more that goes into it because transactional funding is protected by escrow. It is in escrow funding. It is protected by the title company, by the escrow, by the contracts. This kind of stuff, this is all experience. So if you're somebody watching this right now, you're trying to make that first 10K without any experience, without any of your own money, this is not the way to do it. But what you need to understand is that this is a thing and this is what it looks like so that when somebody comes and talks to you, you can differentiate that and either say, A, I'm not doing that, I'm focusing on transactional funding, that's what I say, or if you do have experience or you want to get into something like this, then you at least know how to identify it. So that's gap funding. That is our second longest form of funding. And now we're going to jump into our final form, which is by far the longest version. Okay, now the last thing that we're going to talk about is PML. And PML again stands for private money lending. Now, this one's going to be the shortest because private money lending is the most broad thing ever. You can always look at the name to kind of figure things out, right? It's literally just private money lending. So you could be lending your sister money to buy a new car. You could be lending your grandparents money. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just private money lending. It's very vague. But let me give you a general overview of what it looks like because once you get into the funding space, I promise people will come to you asking for all types of money and you need to know what's what. So first of all, private money lending, who needs it? Well, we've talked about wholesalers and buyers, right? A wholesaler is a middleman. They're only in the transaction for a second, they're reselling properties, then they're hands off. So a wholesaler is not going to need private money, right? They're not long term. So really, when we talk about private money, in some form or fashion, you're going to be working with buyers, okay? That can be fix and flippers. It can just be regular rental property investing buyers. Any of those people are going to use it. Now, the thing that you need to understand about private money lending is, again, as always, timeline and amount of money. Now, private money lending is a long-term play, which means you get paid less, and typically, although not always, but typically it's going to be more safe. It's the closer version of one of my most hated words, passive income, right? So the timeline for private money lending is typically going to be greater than 1 year. So I come to you and say, hey Ryan, I need $100,000 for 5 years. It's not gap lending, it's not EMD, it's not transactional, it's not double close, right? It's private money, it's long term. They need it to go purchase a property and rent it out, and then they're gonna pay you interest for the next 5 years. So greater than 1 year, it can go on, I mean, you know, it could be 50 years in theory, and they're gonna be paying you on average 12 to 15% per year. That's our rate, right? So if somebody says, I need $100,000 from you, I'll pay you 12% a year interest, that is a private money loan. Now again, very broad, very vague. You could be lending it on a house, you could be lending it on a car, you could be lending it on basically anything. Obviously for the basis of this video, we're mostly talking about real estate, but in general, it's very broad. So really the only thing you need to understand here, if you understand everything else we just talked about, then this will kind of just fall into place, but you just need to know private money lending, long-term, right? Lower return, more protected, long-term. Gap lending is that in between. EMD is the 30 days, and then double closing is less than 24 hours, way quicker. And if you understand this, and if you understand these, and everything we just talked about, You are ahead, and you may not believe me here, but you are ahead of 99% of people. It's crazy because most people get into a conversation and they don't actually know what type of funding they're talking about. But if you can just go through this, rewatch this video, take some notes maybe, and understand what the heck we're talking about, you are right there. You are ready to go get that first deal. So now that you know more than 99% of people about transactional funding, it's time for you to go get a deal. After all, just watching these videos isn't going to do anything for you unless you pair them with action. Lucky for you, I've put together a step-by-step guide on how you can go get your first deal in the next 30 days from scratch. You can click right here for the detailed breakdown and get started.